Really bad news for EBK Jaaybo and his fans. And honestly, this isn't one of those situations where people are overreacting to a headline or turning a minor legal issue into something bigger than it really is. The reason so many people are talking about this right now is because this story appears to have moved beyond the point of speculation. For months, supporters were hoping that somehow EBK Jaaybo would find a way to keep his momentum going, continue building his career, and capitalize on opportunities that most young rappers only dream about. This was a rapper who had started generating real attention. He had music buzzing. He was building a name for himself outside of Stockton. He was connected to one of the biggest XXL freshman moments of the year, and he was reportedly lined up for major opportunities, including performing on NBA YoungBoy's tour. For a lot of artists, that combination of exposure could completely change their life. That's why today's news hits so hard. Because instead of talking about tour dates, music releases, or career growth, people are talking about federal prison, plea agreements, and sentencing. And when a rapper's story changes that dramatically in such a short period of time, it naturally makes people wonder how everything went wrong. According to reports surrounding the federal case, Jaaybo was arrested after a traffic stop in Arkansas while traveling across the country. Authorities reported discovering marijuana, pills, cash, and a Glock pistol that allegedly had a machine gun conversion device attached to it, commonly referred to as a switch. The government later brought several federal charges against him, including charges related to firearm possession and drug trafficking allegations. Now, what's important here is that federal prosecutors initially filed multiple counts, and reports indicate that the potential exposure in the case was extremely serious. That's one of the reasons why this story immediately grabbed attention in hip-hop media. People weren't looking at this like a routine arrest. They were looking at it as a case that could potentially alter the trajectory of a young artist's entire career. Because once federal authorities become involved, the conversation changes. Federal cases move differently. Federal penalties can be significant. And the uncertainty surrounding those cases tends to follow artists for a very long time. What makes this situation even more frustrating for supporters is the timing. If you look at where Jaaybo's career appeared to be heading before all of this happened, it's difficult not to see the opportunities that were sitting right in front of him. He had reportedly been selected for the XXL freshman class, one of the biggest platforms available for a new rapper trying to break into the mainstream. Whether people love XXL or criticize it, there's no denying that being associated with that list puts an artist in front of millions of people. On top of that, there was the NBA YoungBoy tour opportunity. Think about how many rappers spend years trying to get a chance like that. Think about how many artists would do almost anything to perform in front of those crowds and build that kind of fan base. That's why so many people are looking at this situation and shaking their heads. Not because they dislike Jaaybo's music, but because they feel like he had opportunities that many people never get. And now those opportunities appear to be slipping away because of decisions that allegedly happened far away from any concert stage or recording studio. The thing that keeps coming up whenever people discuss this case is the idea of risk versus reward. That's the conversation happening all over social media. People are asking why someone who allegedly had so much to gain would take risks that could potentially jeopardize everything. Again, the legal process will determine the final outcome. But from a public perception standpoint, that's the question many people keep returning to. Because if you're on your way to one of the biggest moments of your career, most people assume your focus is on protecting that opportunity. Most people assume your focus is on making sure nothing gets in the way. That's why the story feels so tragic to some supporters. They don't just see a criminal case. They see a situation where somebody who appeared to be climbing toward success suddenly found themselves facing consequences that could completely change the direction of their life. What appears to have made the situation even more serious is that reports later indicated Jaaybo entered a plea involving certain charges, while other counts were reportedly dismissed as part of that process. According to the reporting, the remaining counts still carry substantial potential penalties. That's important because many fans initially assumed there might be a path where the entire case somehow disappeared. But once plea discussions enter the conversation, people start looking at the reality of sentencing rather than simply debating whether charges will stick. And that's where the mood around the case began changing. Suddenly, supporters weren't talking about whether there would be charges. They were talking about how much time he could potentially face. That's a completely different conversation, and it's one that nobody wanted to be having when just months earlier the focus was supposed to be on music, touring, and career growth. Another reason this story resonates with so many people is because it fits a pattern that hip-hop has unfortunately seen too many times before. A young artist starts gaining momentum. The opportunities get bigger. The spotlight gets brighter. The future starts looking promising. Then something happens outside the music that completely changes the narrative. Fans begin asking what could have been. Industry observers begin wondering how far the artist might have gone if circumstances had been different. That's why some people are describing this as one of the biggest missed opportunities of the year. Not because Jaaybo was guaranteed superstardom, but because he was clearly positioned for a major breakthrough moment. Whether that breakthrough would have turned into long-term success is impossible to know. But what people do know is that the conversation today looks completely different from the conversation people were having before the arrest. And that's ultimately why so many people are saying this is really bad news for EBK Jaaybo and his fans. Not because the music suddenly became less popular, not because his supporters disappeared, and not because anybody knows exactly what the final sentence will be. It's because the momentum that seemed to be building around his career has now been replaced by uncertainty. Instead of people asking how big he can become, they're asking what happens next. Instead of discussing future opportunities, they're discussing legal consequences. And regardless of where someone stands on the case itself, that's a difficult reality for any young artist to face. The opportunities were there. The spotlight was there. The platform was there. And now the future looks far less certain than it did just a few months ago.